The Conquest of America, Voyage 1, 1492 to 93, and Voyage 2, 1493 to 96.
Christopher Columbus, an Italian explorer and navigator, is credited for the foundation and subsequent European colonization of the Americas. He sailed from Spain on 4 voyages to accomplish his missions and was financed by the Catholic Spanish monarchs. The information of Columbus's 4 voyages and his discovery of the New World is documented in many letters and journals written by him, his son Hernando, and 2 other local and royal historians, namely Captain Gonzalo Fernandez de Oviedo and Fray Bartolome de las Casas. Oviedo, in his books, talks about the lineage, education, and knowledge of Columbus on various commercial voyages. Columbus expressed interest in this avenue because of a pilot whose ship submerged on the coast of one of the India islands and who had told him about it. He believed that this island was Asia. Columbus had opened his home for this pilot, and thus he told him about the islands and swore secrecy. Only Columbus had this information and kept it to himself. Once Columbus knew what he wanted to do with this information, he went to the courts of different kings to ask for fundings. He was laughed out of England's King Harry VIII's court, considering Columbus's plan to be a farce. He then had negotiations with King John II of Portugal and was denied funds from there too. Finally, he landed in Castile, Spain, and after many years of groveling and shoveling was he provided funding by the Catholic monarchs King Ferdinand and Queen Isabel on the conditions of converting the inhabitants of China and Japan to Christianity. He was also awarded the title of Don and High Admiral of the Ocean Sea and Viceroy of every island he would discover in his tour of the East. He wanted to establish a trade route between the Castile port of Spain to China. His flagship was the Santa Maria, and the Queen provided him with 2 caravels, Nina and Pinta. These were to be under the command of 2 expert sailors, Martin Alonso and Vincent Yanes of the Pinzon family. He also had a crew of 90 men with him, and thus set sail on the 3rd of August 1492 in the search of a land with abundant gold and spices. It was widely believed in the then Spain that the islands that Christopher Columbus had found were discovered already many centuries ago, but the Spaniards had forgotten the way to them. It was also common consensus that Columbus was a learned man in the field of cosmography and was said to mark out a fresh discovery. Oviedo, the royal historian, believed that the Indies, or the Hesperides known then, belonged to the kingdom of Spain for 3,193 years, and Columbus had again set out to reclaim the land under the guidance of the Lord. Columbus was heavily inspired by Greek cosmographers and believed that the earth was spherical, or at least in the shape of a pear, and that one could reach the east by sailing through the west. He believed that the distance between Portugal and Chipangu, or Japan, would be of 2,760 miles, when in actuality it was around 12,000 miles. Never before had the Spaniards strayed further than the sight of land, and to reach China or Japan they would have to sail into the ocean, lose sight of the land, and use the quadrants of the pole star every night to devise their path for the next day. And Columbus was the first man in Spain to practice the art of navigating the wide ocean seas by measuring the height in degrees of the sun and the North Star. Columbus was always described as a charming man, one who could get his way and was equally testy when annoyed. But he was extremely inept in handling his men. He could not share power and often quarreled with his captains, leading to the point of mutiny. Columbus was also a very delusional man. He believed that the island of Hispaniola, which he discovered on his first voyage, was Japan, and that Cuba was the Asiatic mainland. He made his crew swear and take an oath that they were indeed in Asia. His delusions were further fueled by his need to be portrayed as successful so that he could get more funding for his future endeavors. As it turned out, the Caribbean islands were not in fact Asia, and thus there were no spices or gold in the right quantity. The only thing valuable that could be used were the natives as slave laborers. He was also a devout Christian, which compelled him to spread the word of the Lord. To know more about the discovery of the Americas, we will be talking about the first and the second voyage of Columbus in detail.
In January 1492, the same month when the war between Catholic Spain and Muslims concluded, Columbus was granted permission for his first voyage. This westward journey aimed to reach the rich lands of the Great Khans in the east with a twofold purpose: pursuit of wealth and conversion of the people of the east. On 12th May, Columbus left Granada for the seaport of Palos to prepare for his first voyage of discovery. There he prepared 3 ships for his journey: the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina. Columbus reached the island of Salts and set sail southwest on Friday, 3rd August. It is said that Columbus intended to make a pit stop at the Canaries, which were the westernmost land known at the time. His correspondent, Toscanelli, estimated the distance between Lisbon and the Asian city of Quince, that is China, as less than 1,000 leagues westward, with the distance from the Canary Islands being even shorter. Columbus had calculated the distance between Cipangu, Japan, that is Japan, and Portugal to be 2,760 miles, but the actual distance is 12,000 miles. They indeed had to make a pause there for 4 weeks, prompted by the necessity to repair the Pinta's rudder and leakage. During their stay at the Canaries, the crew heard stories of land sightings to the west from the locals. Continuing the journey from Gomera on 6 September, by 8 September, they had ventured far enough into the ocean and did not see any landmass for the following 33 days. Throughout their journey, Columbus and his crew countered signs of land such as tropical birds, whales, speed of the wind, the current of the sea, or floating patches of weeds, but these hopeful signs turned into disappointments. These repeated disappointments could have potentially demoralized them and questioned Columbus's leadership. So, Columbus intentionally reported a lesser distance covered, such as on Monday, September 10, when the crew had sailed 60 leagues, but he reported only 48. On 17 September, the pilots observed that the direction of the compass needle was pointed slightly northwest instead of north. He argued that the deviation was due to the movement of the pole star and concluded that the needle will align with the changing position of the star. Through the journey, Columbus held onto his belief that they were approaching the landmass and was constantly looking for its signs. In most later writings concerning the first voyage, the crew members are said to have mutinied against Columbus. However, in Columbus's private journal, he described the situation simply as the sailors complaining about the length of the voyage and their reluctance to continue further. Columbus tried to boost their morale by telling them about the potential profits they would gain from the voyage. On the 11th of October, the crew members noticed signs of proximity to land. After sailing west, southwest, and then west, the Pinta sighted land. Rodrigo de Triana was the first sailor who saw the landmass. The primary sources concerning the voyage says Columbus had noticed a light earlier but hesitated to confirm it. Land was officially sighted at about 2 hours after midnight, that is on the 12th of October. Columbus was eventually awarded with annuity for discovering the land. Thereafter, the crew went on from island to island in the Caribbean in search of gold. The westward journey from Europe to Asia was expected to be shorter. However, the actual distance across the North Atlantic and North Pacific to reach Asia was approximately 3 times greater than what Columbus had calculated. This miscalculation and the prior absence of any knowledge about the presence of the continents of America led to the misconception that the crew had reached Asia when they first landed on the shores of the Americas in 1492. The identification of Guanahani, where Columbus first landed in the Caribbean, is a topic of debate, but San Salvador in the Bahamas is widely acknowledged as the landfall island. Columbus named it San Salvador and raised Spain's royal flag and officially declared the island as Spain's possession. Columbus sought to approach the natives through friendship and not by force. He also noticed their lack of any significant material possession and technological advancements. He thought they could be converted to Christianity easily and had plans to bring some of them back to Spain. As for gold, he did not find them except few pieces of flat gold that the natives wore as adornments. The natives considered the Europeans the people from the sky. The natives of San Salvador had told the crew members of the people who wore large gold bracelets. Columbus had suspected the authenticity of the information but decided to visit this island because he wanted to claim Spain's possession on every one of the islands he found. He named the island Santa Maria de la Concepcion, Ramque. He sent back a captive of the island with gifts in hopes that they would spread the news to his people that the mariners were good people. The crew then sailed to Fernandina, present-day Long Island, desperate to find gold. Here again, he sent back a captive to his island to create a good impression. He sailed around the island to find gold mines. The inhabitants shared similar language and customs with those on previous islands, but Columbus noted a degree of civilization and higher intelligence among them. One notable observation was that women covered their body parts with pieces of clothes. The next stop was what the inhabitants of the previous islands called Samoet, which according to them was the city of gold. Upon reaching Samoet, Columbus noticed the presence of peculiar trees and plants that could potentially be good for dyes and medicinal spices. Columbus named the island Isabella, that is present-day Crooked Island. Next, they set sail towards what the natives had called Cuba. The natives had told him about the wealth of this island, spices and gold, and where they have sighted large ships and merchandise. This led Columbus to believe that the island of Cuba was Chupangu, that is Japan. On the 28th of October, they landed on Cuba and named it Puerto de San Salvador. He described the island as the most beautiful island he had ever seen, with good ports, deep rivers, and rich variety of flora and fauna. Upon landing on Cuba, Columbus sent 2 Christians and 2 natives, one from San Salvador and another from Cuba, who had rowed up to the ship to venture into the island. They returned with the news of presence of village inland, and its people treated the Christians with respect. When questioned about the presence of gold, pearls, and spices, the indigenous people mentioned that these resources were plentiful in a region they referred to as Bohio, located to the east. Columbus initially believed that he had reached Japan when he landed on Cuba on October 28th, but by November 1st he convinced himself that Cuba was actually the mainland of Cathay, that is China. On 13th November, they set sail for Bohio, and on 21st November, motivated by greed, Martin Alonso Pinzon, the captain of the Pinta, abandoned the other two ships in order to search for Bohio. Columbus reached Bohio on December 5, 1492. Seeing the similarities in geography between Bohio and Spain, he renamed the island in Hispaniola. When the Indian interpreter from San Salvador told the natives that the Christians were men from heaven, they welcomed them. The men returned with the news that the land of gold was further east. On 15 December, the crew reached the island of Tortuga. On 16 December, they came back to Hispaniola. The crew was met with a large group of Indians and the cacique, that is the native lord, who told them gold would be found in the island of Babek. However, Columbus never found this island. On 18 December, the overlord arrived at the ship with a ceremonial parade. Columbus was fascinated with the intricacy of the ceremony and the modesty of the people. They exchanged gifts. The natives who came to the ship were amazed by everything they saw. On 24 December, the Santa Maria met with an accident that completely destroyed it. Columbus sent help to the Lord and later came to his rescue. After this, they established a friendly relationship. The natives from other islands also brought sheets of gold to barter for bells. The Lord of Island complained about the Caribs who came down in group to his island and caused trouble for his people. Columbus promised to provide protection against the Caribs with European weapons. Columbus believed that the shipwreck of the Santa Maria was a divine intervention that allowed him to make a Christian settlement at Hispaniola, which he named as La Navidad. When he set out to return to Castile, he left some of his men in La Navidad. On January 6, the Nina and Pinta were united. Pinzon met excuses on why he abandoned the caravel. Columbus knew Pinzon's intention but decided to accept his apology because he did not want to delay the journey and because most men in his crew were related to Pinzon.
On the 13th of January, the Nina and the Pinta reached the Gulf of Samana in Hispaniola. Anchoring at Cabo Enamorado, Columbus sent a crew of 7 ashore on a boat. The crew was met with a group of fierce-looking inhabitants with faces blacked with charcoal, long hair caught in the back with a small net of parrot feathers, naked as babies and speaking with fierce yet common speech like the rest of the inhabitants encountered. Here the crew engaged in a violent altercation with, as assumed by Columbus, the Caribs, who showered arrows upon them after a failed trade negotiation. 2 of the 55 Caribs were injured by the 7 Spaniards. Columbus was not disappointed by the violent outbreak, but rather pleased as he got to display European might. As a result of this incident, Columbus named the Gulf of Samana as Golfo de las Flacas, Gulf of Arrows. On January 16th, the crew set sail from Golfo de las Flacas, navigating eastward through the Atlantic Ocean aided by favorable winds. However, by the 13th of February, the winds intensified, signaling a turbulent storm ahead. As the ship struggled to stay afloat, the smaller Pinta was compelled to go with the whims of the wind. On the fateful night of 14th February, the Nina and the Pinta were forcibly separated, each vessel enveloped in the dark abyss of the ocean's expanse. Without communications, both groups thought the other had sunk, adding to the uncertainty of the voyage. Columbus and his crew had to create makeshift ballast. As the Nina battled the tempest, it was on the verge of capsizing due to the lightness in its ballast. To counter this perilous situation, empty barrels were hastily filled with seawater to provide necessary stability and prevent disaster. Amidst the looming threat, the crew turned to fervent prayers and acts of devotion, resorting to casting lots to determine who'd embark on a pilgrimage on behalf of the rest. Columbus himself undertook 2 pilgrimages, firstly to Our Lady of Guadalupe and secondly to Santa Clara de Mugua. Another crew member, Pedro de la Villa from Santana, was designated to pilgrimage to Lady Loreto. With the prospect of losing his groundbreaking discovery weighing heavily upon him, Columbus initiated correspondence with the sovereigns of Spain. Expressing profound gratitude for their support in facilitating his historic voyage, he gave a detailed account of his journey, urgently entreating whoever should find his letter to deliver it to the king and queen with utmost haste. Concealing the letter within a tightly sealed parcel of waxed linen, he then ensconced it within a large wooden barrel before throwing the barrel in the sea without anyone knowing the contents inside. The crew thinks it was just another act of devotion. The admiral skillfully guided the caravel towards the Azores, despite the challenging winds pushing from behind. On February 15, 1493, the crew of the Nina spotted land. However, due to the challenging winds, they were unable to come ashore until the 18th, as they temporarily lost sight of the initial sighting of land. During the storm, all the sailors promised to visit the nearest church of Our Lady if they emerged unscathed. Columbus sent half the crew ashore to keep their vow,
planning to follow with the rest later. However, the first group was detained by the island's captain, Joao de Castanera, who suspected them of being pirates. Following a 2 day negotiation period characterized by absence of incriminating disclosures against Columbus and his men, the Castanera chose to release them without charges, failing to subdue Columbus on the orders of King John II, as revealed to the admiral later by his detained crew. Wayward for Castile on March 3rd, the Nina got embroiled in yet another storm, resulting in the severe damage of its sails. Fearing the worst, the crew vowed to undertake another pilgrimage, this time to the Virgin of the Girdles Church in Huelva. Docking near Rastelo on March 4th, Columbus dispatched messages to both the Catholic sovereigns and the King of Portugal, seeking permission to anchor near the city. However, encountering resistance from the Portuguese officer, Columbus found refuge in the king's hospitality, who graciously permitted him to repair his vessel. Subsequently, he was invited to Valparaiso by the King of Portugal, where Columbus was warmly received by the Portuguese nobility upon his arrival on March 9. Continuing his journey back to Lisbon, he stopped at a convent where the Queen of Portugal extended him a dignified welcome befitting his stature. On 13th March, Columbus raised sail for Seville, and on 15th he entered the bay and harbor of Palos, which he had left 7 months and 13 days ago. Finally completing his first voyage, he had discovered the Indies. Often unmentioned in history texts is Pinzon's role as the financial backer of Columbus's voyage. He was the co-owner of both the Nina and the Pinta. Martin Alonso Pinzon was born in 1441 in Palos de Maguer, a capable pilot and a skillful sailor. Separated by the storm on 14 February, Pinzon believed the admiral had perished in the waves. He considered to win the laurels of triumph and favors of the king all to himself. Pinzon traveled to Spain by a separate course and arrived at the northwestern port of Bayonne in early March. He immediately sent a letter to King Ferdinand describing the discovery of the New World. Due to the maritime laws, he had to travel back to the original port of departure, Palos. The Pinta was only a few hours behind Columbus's Nina, but because Columbus had already informed the king about the discovery of the Indies, King Ferdinand refused Pinzon an audience. The elderly Pinzon had arrived back severely ill and exhausted from the voyage. It is suspected he was suffering from syphilis. Exhausted, angry, and disheartened, he died at his birthplace, Palos de Magur, few days after his arrival. The letter from Rastelo written to the monarchs by Christopher Columbus was published everywhere before his arrival. The people of Spain were filled with excitement and enthusiasm. The monarchs of Spain at once wished the presence of Christopher Columbus at the court in Barcelona. The letter bearing instructions for his proceedings were addressed to Don Christopher Columbus, Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy, and the Governor of the islands discovered in the Indies. His journey to Barcelona got delayed owing to the excitement in the towns through which he passed with his entourage that included 6 Indians who had survived the voyage. As he approached Barcelona, a little procession was formed, where everyone wanted to gaze at the foreigners. The Indians were decorated and showcased along with live paraquets that spoke in the native tongue of the Indians, live plants different from those in Spain, ornaments of gold, everything that would give the idea of the wealth of the islands was put on show. Over the summer, the 6 natives were baptized to Christianity. The sovereigns received Columbus in the large hall of the palace Casa de la Diputación, the residence of the king and the queen. Seated on the magnificent throne under a canopy of gold, all the nobles of Spain were also in attendance. When Columbus arrived and was in the process of bending down to kiss their hands, the monarch stood up to greet him as one would do for a great lord, seated him at his side, and bade him to give an account of his voyage. Queen Isabella first got to know of Columbus's discovery not through Columbus or his letter, but from King John II of Portugal, through a letter stating that the Spanish land-finding was in direct violation of the Treaty of Alcacovas. The Treaty of Alcacovas was a part of a 1479 peace agreement that helped unite Spain and end the war with Portugal gaining rights to all the seas south of the Canary Islands. Columbus's voyage violated the agreement because he went south of the Canary Islands. Spain wanted to beat Portugal to the race to the discovery of the New World and sent a papal ambassador to the Pope with instructions to obtain the Pope's permission to colonize the territory Columbus had newly discovered. On May 4, 1493, before the Spanish diplomats could finish negotiating the issue to an end with the Portuguese, Pope Alexander VI issued a papal bull granting permission for Spain to colonize all the land west of the 38th-degree longitude, and Portugal is granted the permission to colonize the land east of the 38th parallel. Portugal refuted the decision, and ultimately the Treaty of Tordesillas was signed on 7 June 1494, which moved the line west to the 48th-degree longitude. The new agreement ended the political strife between the two countries.
The second voyage starts with the Admiral's second expeditions, which aim to relieve colonies and conquer Hispaniola. It begins with the Pope's grant, most liberally granted them not only that they had conquered so far, but also everything that they should still discover further west as far as the Orient, insofar as no Christian prince had actual possession, and he forbade all others to encroach on these boundaries. Guadalupe was the first Carib village which was found. Then the admiral set his course to discover Carib as they were nearer to Spain and on direct route to Hispaniola. In San Martin, they encountered with Caribs. The landing party took some captives, mostly Caribs. Then a canoe with some Caribs came with their bows and attacked the ship. Carib claimed to have found gold in Sire. Then the crew moved on to Sire, passing through Hispaniola. He decided to arrive on La Navidad, where they went back to meet left Spaniards from previous voyage. When they reached there, they got to know that some of them died from sickness and that others had been killed in quarrels among themselves. Next day, the admiral ordered that all ground within the Christian fortifications should be searched, since he had instructed them to bury any quantities of gold they might obtain. The Indian identified 11 Christians who were killed by Canobo and Myrene and claimed they were murdered out of jealousy. The admiral received gold from Gukengari as a gesture of goodwill. Gukengari, as pure-hearted native, displayed courtesy and expressed deep concern for the death of Christian. What actually went down there was questionable. The detail of the story was never fully drawn from the natives, since the Spaniards had been cruel and licentious in their dealing with the Indians. They had quarreled among themselves, and the natives in revenge had destroyed them all. Admiral decision to return to coast for gold discoveries, where he established new colony and start to the search of gold. In the neighborhood, they find many gold fields, and it is said to be known that Niti in the territory of Canobo, who killed the Christians, other are in the district called Cibao. Two different parties under different captains were sent to Cibao and Niti. Alonso de Ojeda was sent to search for goldfields of Cibao, where he found gold in over 50 streams. The captain from Niti also found gold in 3 or 4 places. The discovery made the sovereign the richest and most prosperous on earth. Columbus chose Isabela as the new city due to its fertility of soil and the tropical climate. The admiral fell ill and left a gap in his diary. While he was ill, a mutiny broke out, which he had to suppress by strong measures. Many of the crew members plotted to renounce the admiral's authority. On March 12th, he left Isabela for Cibao to see the goldfields with his fit men and with necessary tools and supplies for building a fort and protecting Christians. He reached Cibao, then ordered for building the fort of Santo Tomas. It was intended to dominate the region of goldfields and to be a place safety for Christians going on them. On April 1, a messenger from Santo Tomas Fort sent news of Indians fleeing from their village and Caic preparing to burn the fort. The admiral sent more men, and Hodeja left Isabela on 9 April with over 400 men, seized the Caic of the district. He also seized chieftain's heir due to his treatment of 3 Christians on his way from Isabela to Santo Tomas. The Caic, relying on his service to the Christian, intervened for the prisoners. He wept at the sight of the execution, and the guilty Indians promised to never commit another crime. And then the admiral formed a council to govern the island, consisting of Don Diego Colon as president, Father Buell and Pedro Hernandez Cornell as regents, Alfonso Esquez Carvajal as a magistrate, and Juan de Lojan as a gentleman of Madrid. The council worked diligently. The island fertility was so great, the news of news reaches and mines every day. The admiral left with 3 ships for the further exploration of Cuba, which he had left only partly examined in his first voyage. Jamaica. The admiral sighted Jamaica, hoping to confirm reports of gold. Columbus found the island well peopled, and from what he saw of the natives, thought they were more igneous and better artificial than any Indians he had seen before. But when he proposed to land, they generally showed themselves prepared to resist him. Admiral struggled on Cuban coast. The admiral leaving Jamaica reached Santa Cruz, a cap on Cuban coast, but was overtaken by a heavy thunderstorm with lightning. The admiral sighted as many as 160 islets, each with different size and beauty, and then he goes on to explain the beauty of the flora and fauna of that place. Seeing that the coast of Cuba is stretched much further to the west, he decided to turn back to Hispaniola. Admiral distress and island rebellion. Admiral suffered illness and revolt due to Pedro Margaret's misconduct. Margaret leaves for the Vega Real, making no effort to control and pacify the island, decided to not wait for the admiral to give a complete account for his action. Then the Spaniards robbed and seized Indian women, leading to vengeance on any Spaniards. Uticana, the Caic of Magdalena, killed 10 Christians and secretly ordered the firing of a house. He was severely punished upon his return. 6 or 7 other Caic were also punished for injuries done to Christian. The island was in a bad state, with Christian committing numerous outrages, and the admiral says the Indians refused to return to obedience. The 4 principal rulers agreed not to resume obedience. Gukengari, ruler of Navidad, requested the admiral to return, help in returning his women, and help him revenge his injuries. Admiral's warplane and the Battle of Isabela. Admiral left Isabela on 24 March allied with Gukengari. He divided his army and attacked the Indians from 2 different directions. The Indians fled and the admiral men pursued them, killing and causing havoc. The admiral captured Canobo, the principal king of all. He confessed to the murder of 20 Christians who remained in Navidad. The admiral received information for informants, sent Canobo and one of his brothers to the Spain. Canobo was sentenced and found guilty by the Spanish authorities. Post-capture, peace and conquest. After the victory, the Christian fortunes became prosperous. The Hispaniola was reduced to peace and obedience, with all promising to pay tribute to the Catholics every 3 months. To ensure payment, discs of brass or copper were made to be worn around the neck. Quarrel among the Christians were not likely to have been successful without these measures. The Christian safety was assured. Admiral attributed peace to God providence and the good fortune of Catholic sovereigns. They conquered large population of 200 men despite being ill-armed and half-sick. Victories and conquests were attributed to God's will and mighty hand, not the strength of the Christian force.
The assumptions about the natives were based on the information from the first voyage. The document states that the admiral wanted to come to the Carib Islands, whose inhabitants are described as man-eaters because it was nearer to Spain and directly on the road to Hispaniola. The admiral also proceeds to talk about the Caribs and says that these people seem to us more civilized than those elsewhere. But on what scale of civilization exactly are they being judged on? Statements like this prove the prejudiced view that the Europeans had of the natives. The lack of inferences on the natives makes them secondary to even the flora and fauna of the islands, which is discussed vividly. Natives are described as beastly and uncivilized. However, various instances in the document itself prove otherwise. They judge the natives through their preconceived notions and what they think is morally right. Instead of understanding the natives in their own light, they have taken the route of imposing European beliefs on them. As we read between the lines of the text, we come to find out that the natives had a well-organized society with their own belief system, with ideas of community, property, and material wealth which cannot be compared to any other. They are welcoming and respect the foreigners, but to call them passive would be incorrect. Instances of native resistance are present throughout the document, but the Eurocentric perspective doesn't perceive it as so. Violent disputes, massacres, and other crimes were the result of European and indigenous interactions. However, the native resistance mainly is retaliation to protect their territory, people, and way of life. Michael Dickinger's shameful encounter with a Carib woman described in the text shows that Europeans did not respect the women's consent and bodily autonomy. She was thrashed and dehumanized, called a whore for refusing him sexual pleasure, on one hand, and also slut-shamed for submitting to the situation after considerable violence. On what parameter of civilization does this act fall on if the natives are described as beastly? Talking about the religion and customs of the natives, nature comes out to be an important part. Columbus even mentions the presence of idols of all kinds in their houses. When asked about them, they answer that the idols are ture, that is to say that they belong to the sky. In Hispaniola, it is mentioned that all the natives say that they wish to be Christians, although they are idolaters. But it seems like a far stretch, motivated by Columbus's second most important motive of the voyage, conversion of the natives to Christianity. Wooden images carved in relief, called semis, were also discovered. These were associated with commemoration of their ancestors and also with the clan's pride. There is also an incident of deception mentioned that is concerned with these semis that speak. Regarding the funerary rites, we see that when a man is on the verge of death, they strangle him, and this is practiced only with the kikes of the clan. Others are carried out of the house, and yet others are placed on hammocks or string beds, with bread and water laid beside their heads. The natives had certain principles that they stood by, even during attacks on other islands. Caribs did not harm the family. The use of arrows was prevalent instead of iron weapons, and they also spun good quality cotton. The kindness of natives also comes out in their encounter with the Europeans in Hispaniola. Even when at first they showed hostility to Spaniards, but later they kept their bow and arrows down and offered food, water, and drinks to them, which tells us a lot about them being cultured and having ethos. When the admiral comes to Cabo de la Cruz on 18th July, he was welcomed by the Indians, who brought him plenty of their cassava bread, which they make from grated roots, much fish, and a great quantity of fruit and other things that they eat. We have description of their man-eating habits. Caribs are said to eat the male children that they have by the women captured during raids, and only bring up the children of their own women. And as for the men they are able to capture, they bring those who are alive home to be slaughtered, and eat those who are dead on spot. Human bones were also found in their houses, and they were so gnawed that no flesh was left on them, except what was too tough to be eaten. In Hispaniola, the admiral comes across 3 stones of worship. One of them is beneficial to the plants and grains, another for rain and sun when they are needed, and the third is for painless childbirth. This shows the society's ethos and the important position held by women as nurturers of human life. Further descriptions tell us that women carried arms and defended their territory just like their male counterparts. They encounter a lady or a female kike in Guadalupe who they capture. It is said that the whole island was inhabited by women and that people who had prevented their boats from landing were also women, showing that they had considerable authority in the native society. These women are described by the Spaniards as more intelligent than the women of the other islands, since in other places, time is only reckoned by the sun in the day and moon at night, whereas these women reckon time by the stars also. On their way back to Portugal, the crew faced a near starvation situation. Some of them wished to imitate the Caribs and eat the Indians they had aboard. Others, in order to economize little food they had, were in favor of throwing the Indians overboard.